Hello everyone. Before we get into this week's episode, just a quick programming note. For as long as I've been doing the show, people have been asking me for episode transcripts. My response has always been the same. The time necessary to take notes and transpose them into a useful transcript would simply be prohibitive, given how much work production already is. Now, however, thanks to our generous patrons, we can finally start working on this at long last. It's going to take a while given 500 episodes, and some of my old notes are no longer with us, thanks to some issues with my old University of Washington account, but it's still a fantastic undertaking, and it is only possible because of our patrons, both for History of Japan and for the Facing Backward Network. So, patrons, one more time, thank you all so much for your support. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 492, The Whipping Boy. As you have probably noticed, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, I find political power very interesting to think about. After all, if you understand how power is organized in a society, you can learn a great deal, both about how it operates and the ideology that is used to justify the existing order, among other things. And this in turn means I find the Tokugawa shogunate endlessly fascinating. Its combination of warrior ethos and Confucianism, of advanced bureaucracy with dense traditional ritual, is just endlessly interesting to me. And when we talk about the Tokugawa shoguns, there are a few names that tend to always come up. Ieyasu, of course, as the dynastic founder, Yoshinobu as the one who oversaw the end of the shogunate, they're pretty common. Then there are guys like Tsunayoshi, the so-called dog shogun, or Iemochi, who reads, to me at least, like a sad victim of circumstance being manipulated by basically everyone around him. These men tend to stand out because of the times they lived in. Ieyasu at the foundation of the dynasty, Tsunayoshi at its zenith, Iemochi and Yoshinobu during the age of its collapse. But there's one more name that, I think, is worth some consideration when looking at the arc of the Tokugawa family, but who usually doesn't get that much attention when we do. In part, that's because of the time he lived in. Tokugawa Ienari did not live during the dramatic ages of the shogunate. His reign spanned a big chunk of what might be called the beginning of the end, well after the height of the dynasty, but before things really started to go to hell, or I guess go to Naraka in a handbasket. This was, in the history of the Tokugawa shogunate, a time of conservatism, of maintenance of what came before, even in the face of evidence that perhaps things were beginning to shift and that change was needed. If you think about politics from the perspective of dramatic shifts of policy or reform or what have you, there's not a lot to talk about here. But that's not the same thing as claiming there's nothing to say. This was a period where the personal virtue of the ruler and the strength and legitimacy of the government were largely conflated, and for that reason, I think Ienari is worth some interest from us. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have heard of Tokugawa Ienari, the 11th shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty, it's very likely that you know one of two things about him. First, Ienari is by far the longest reigning shogun of the Tokugawa shogunate. He was formally enthroned as shogun in 1787 at the tender age of 14 by the Western reckoning, and would remain in office all the way to 1837, a staggering 50 years as the titular head of the shogunate. But that's not all. Like many of his forebears, even after officially retiring and taking the title of Ogosho, or retired shogun, handing over power to his son Ieyoshi in the bargain, Ienari did not really give up ruling. Ienari continued to call the shots, more or less ignoring the will of his son, who was theoretically the actual shogun, for 4 more years until his death in 1841. So that's 54 years in the top spot, a pretty remarkable accomplishment just in its own right. For comparison, the next two highest on the length of reign chart are shoguns number 4 and 5, Tokugawa Ieyatsuna and Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, both of whom managed 29 years in the top job, so about half as long. Of course, how long you can keep a seat warm for is not necessarily the most impressive accomplishment against which to judge your life. And there is one other thing for which Ienari is known, though to be honest, I'm not sure how he'd feel about it personally: his lifestyle. Specifically, Ienari is often described as one of the most degenerate members of the Tokugawa dynasty, concerned more with dissipating himself in the pleasures of wine and women than with, actually ruling anything. And of course, stories about monarchs who have gone crazy with power and wealth are nothing new. Ienari was a contemporary, after all, of Marie Antoinette in France, who literally lost her head over accusations of impropriety, among other things. Having taught history for a while now, I can attest personally that there's nothing quite like a tale of monarchical debauchery to get the attention of a room full of students. However, Ienari's reputation is important for reasons beyond its ability to be useful in putting together my stand-up comedy routine, lecture notes. You see, as I alluded to earlier, his personal behavior was thought, in the political framework of his time, to reflect on the fundamental righteousness of the government itself. Why? It all comes back to Confucius. Confucianism as a political ideology and philosophy has a long history in East Asia, of course, and more or less from the jump, one of the crucial ideas of the whole philosophy was the idea that the personal virtue of the ruler reflected the virtue of the government itself. That notion goes back to Confucius himself. In the Analects of Confucius, Book 12, Analect 19, there's this fascinating little exchange. Quote, Ji Kangzi asked Confucius about government, saying, "What would you think if, in order to move closer to those who possess the way, I were to kill those who do not follow the way?" Confucius answered, "In administering your government, what need is there for you to kill? Just desire the good yourself, and the common people will be good. The virtue of the superior man is like the wind, the virtue of the inferior man is like the grass. Let the wind blow over the grass, and it is sure to bend." That theme was picked up by Mencius, the second founder of Confucianism, so to speak, who wrote a few centuries later. His writings include one of my very favorite exchanges in the history of philosophy, coming from Book 1b, number 6. In this section, Mencius repeatedly questions King Xuan of Qi. King Xuan himself was another ruler more concerned with pleasure than with rule, and Mencius would eventually leave the kingdom of Qi out of frustration with the king's failure to correct his own misbehavior. In this particular exchange, Mencius asks the king what he would do if, having entrusted the care of his family to a friend while away on a long trip, he returned to find his family in disarray and poorly cared for. The king naturally says, "I would find a new friend." Mencius then asks, "What if your captain of the guard failed to manage the very guards he was supposed to lead?" And of course the king says, "I'd get a new captain of the guard." And then finally Mencius asks, quote, "And what if there were disorder within the borders of the state? What then?" The king turned to his other courtiers and changed the subject. It's not stated directly, of course, but the implied answer is, get a new king. And this is, quite literally, a revolutionary principle, implying the legitimacy of the government itself is predicated on whether or not the king can be judged as fit to rule. And part of that judgment of fitness, in turn, is the moral character of the ruler. If you are familiar with the concept of the mandate of heaven in Chinese history, the notion that heaven itself bestows legitimacy upon a ruling dynasty and can take it away, you know that the moral unfitness and capriciousness of rulers was one sign they had lost the mandate. Even in Japan, where the notion of the mandate of heaven was not as embedded into the political framework as it was in China, the notion that the moral character of the ruler reflected the quality of a government had a great deal of currency. So the fact that Tokugawa Ienari was possessed of, shall we say, a wandering eye and a fondness for parties and drink was not just an indictment of his personal character or of his enablers in the office of the shogun. It was an indictment of the fundamental moral character of the shogunate, and thus of its suitability as a government. And it is worth noting that Ienari's reign, for practical purposes, ended in 1841, and that's only 27 years before the end of the shogunate itself. This connection did not, suffice it to say, go unnoticed. But before we get to these matters of historical reputation, what do we actually know about Tokugawa Ienari the man? Well, for starters, he was not in fact born the heir to the shogunate. The 10th shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, took office in 1760 at the age of 23. That might seem a bit young, but it was a matter of political necessity. Ieyasu's own father, the 9th shogun Ieyasu, was both sickly and had chronic ailments which affected his speech very badly. This did not win him many friends in a system predicated on warrior power and strength, and his own retainers pushed for his abdication as soon as there was a viable alternative in Ieyasu. In point of fact, Ieyasu himself had likely been chosen by his predecessor, the talented and well-regarded shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune, as a simple seat warmer for his grandson Ieyasu, who was charismatic and diligent and generally well-liked, but who was also 13 when his grandfather died, so a bit young for the top job. Ieyasu was a popular choice as shogun. He was thoughtful, frugal, and his only real vices were falconry, which is an appropriately upper-crust hobby, and shogi, or Japanese-style chess, at which he was supposedly quite good, although I do have to wonder how many people were brave enough to legitimately try and beat him. Even so, Ieyasu did not have an easy time as shogun. His time in office was stressful to say the least. It's remembered best for things like the Great Tenmei Famine, which killed or displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and which was exacerbated by not one but two separate volcanic eruptions in 1783, of Mount Asama in central Honshu, and Mount Iwaki on the northern end of the island. One of Ieyasu's own advisors, Tanuma Okitsugu, was blamed by many for the famine. He'd jacked up tax levels and fiddled with the market price of rice by removing some of it from circulation in order to try and stabilize the shogunate's finances, and this was seen, not unjustifiably, as having exacerbated the famine conditions. Probably, but not definitely because of this, Okitsugu's son Okimoto was actually assassinated by a disgruntled samurai in the shogun's own palace. In the aftermath, Okitsugu retired from politics to mourn, and many of his policies were reversed. Simply put, this was not an easy time to be shogun, and I have to imagine this contributed to Ieyasu's relatively young death at the age of 49. But before he died, Ieyasu had one other problem he had to solve. Like all shoguns, he had been forced into a political marriage at a young age, with a distant relative of the imperial family, actually, and had 2 concubines to boot. Yet while he was able to have children, 4 in point of fact, none of them made it to adulthood. The longest lived was his initial heir, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was born in 1762 and lived until 1779, so 17, when he took ill and died very suddenly while he was out hawking, a favored pastime of both himself and his father. Ieyamoto's sudden and untimely death led to all sorts of salacious rumors that he'd been bumped off by one or another advisor who did not want a young, independent-minded shogun in office, but none of those salacious rumors have any evidence to back them up, and it's not like these things didn't just happen from time to time, especially in the age before modern medicine. Ieyasu's other children were far less healthy. His 2 daughters by his primary wife, Chiyohime and Manjuhime, both died before their teenage years, and his second son, Sadajiro, lived only 1 year. And by all accounts, this all absolutely destroyed Ieyasu, who loved his children very deeply and was overcome with sadness by their loss. It also left him with a far more practical problem. The system needed an heir, and he could not provide one. Fortunately, there was a baked-in solution for the problem, the so-called cadet houses. The House of Tokugawa got its start as a ruling dynasty, of course, in 1600, and families being what they are, and especially family structures that allow for legitimate offspring from multiple female partners being what they are, soon there were far more Tokugawa children rolling around than anyone knew what to do with. The solution was to set these kids up as cadet houses. Plop them down in a fiefdom somewhere, like a regular member of the feudal elite, but also with some special privileges recognizing their special relationship with the shogunate, and thus their strong stake in preserving the shogunate as an institution. Lords from these cadet houses were often advisors to the shogun or trusted to deal with sensitive matters the shogun couldn't handle personally. And when there was no readily available heir, they could provide one. Specifically, any of these houses could offer up a son to be adopted by an heirless shogun. That adopted child would then legally be the shogun's son and could inherit the throne, while the biological family would of course be richly rewarded in the short term and enjoy influence from having their son take up the top job when the time came. As you might imagine, there were no shortage of volunteers for this prestigious honor when it came up. Which brings us at long last to Tokugawa Ienari, born the biological son of Hitotsubashi Harusada, who in turn was descended from the 9th shogun Yoshimune's 4th son Munetada. For those of you keeping track at home, this makes Munetada the younger brother of Tokugawa Ieyasu, that unpopular and very sickly shogun. Ienari was of course not the only candidate to take over. There were many other Tokugawa branch houses out there, and plenty of them had a son or two to spare to fulfill this prestigious duty. However, Ienari had one qualification the others didn't. He was extremely young. Specifically, Ienari was adopted into the primary Tokugawa branch in 1781 at the tender age of 8 by the Western reckoning, and his youth made him the ideal candidate in the eyes of one of the shogun's advisors. This was Matsudaira Sadanobu, who was engaged in a bit of clever political gamesmanship. Sadanobu, you see, wanted power, and he wanted a young, pliable shogun in office so that he could have it by controlling him from behind the scenes. Remember that advisor whose son was assassinated, Tanuma Okitsugu? Well, Matsudaira hated Tanuma and worked very hard to bring about his downfall, and if you're wondering, of course there are a bunch of rumors that are salacious but totally unproven, that Matsudaira Sadanobu had Tanuma Okitsugu's son bumped off as a part of a plot to bring Tanuma down by destroying him emotionally. More historically provable is the fact that Matsudaira bribed his way into the shogun's inner circle, specifically to the leadership of the Roju, the senior council of shogunal advisors, and there used his influence to push the grieving Tanuma out, stripping his projects of funding and sidelining Tanuma himself. Matsudaira was also friendly with Hitotsubashi Harusada and convinced Harusada both to offer up his son as shogunal heir and bring about the other cadet houses to supporting the young boy's candidacy. As for the sitting shogun Ieyasu, after losing his own children, he doesn't seem to have thought too deeply about the matter and simply accepted the advice of his counselors to go with Ienari. And in 1786, Ieyasu finally died, heartbroken. It took until the next year for the ceremonies to enthrone Ieyasu formally as shogun to go forward, but on paper he was now running the country. Except of course that really he was not, because who would listen to a 14-year-old about how to run a complicated feudal government? Really, Matsudaira Sadanobu was the one calling the shots. And he had big plans, finishing off Tanuma Okitsugu for one by placing his former rival under house arrest, and then stripping him of a large part of his feudal holdings. Tanuma would die in house arrest in the early summer of 1788, leaving to his grandson Okiaki a fiefdom that had lost 2/3 of its former value. For another, Matsudaira had ambitious plans for reforming the shogunate, the so-called Kansei reforms, named after the era in which they were enacted. Like many attempts by the Tokugawa shogunate to reform itself in its later years, the Kansei reforms were a mixture of a few good ideas, the imposition of an exam system intended to promote officials on merit, or land grants to farmers displaced by famines intended to repopulate undercultivated farmland, with a great many socially conservative and pointless ideas like new sumptuary laws which ineffectively tried to ban commoners from wearing nice clothes, or laws banning non-orthodox interpretations of Confucian texts. Fundamentally, like so many reforms before and after, the Kansei reforms were unable to address the root problems of the Tokugawa structure because those problems were far deeper than the fact that uppity commoners were wearing silk or that young samurai were being taught the wrong way to read Confucius. Sadanobu was eventually forced to resign in 1793 after his reforms failed to fix all that much of anything, and after he himself fell afoul of his ostensible puppet shogun. Because while Tokugawa Ienari had been chosen because theoretically he was both young and very pliable, in fact, the young boy was both extremely willful and not super interested in taking anyone's advice. The break between the two men came in 1792, when Ienari advanced a somewhat unusual idea to his advisors. He wanted his birth father, Hitotsubashi Harusada, to be granted the title of Ogosho, or retired shogun, and set up with his own wing of Chiyoda Castle in Edo, what's now the Imperial Palace. This was completely unprecedented. The only people to be granted the title of retired shogun in the past had, at one point, actually been the shogun, not just the shogun's dad. Furthermore, such a title and position, not to mention a spot in Chiyoda Castle, would make Harusada very influential, possibly even enough to challenge Matsudaira Sadanobu's position. Sadanobu thus blocked the appointment on the grounds that it was without precedent. In fact, he'd just blocked an identical request from the sitting emperor, Kokaku, who had also been adopted from a cadet house of the imperial family, and who wished to honor his birth father with the position of retired emperor. Sadanobu prevented this for the exact same reasons, and even summoned two Kyoto nobles responsible for advancing the idea to Edo to be confined under house arrest. But Sadanobu's own grip on power was a bit rocky given how little meaningful change his reforms had produced, and as the personal rift between him and the shogun widened as a result of this whole thing, he was eventually forced to offer his resignation as a show of humility and deference to his lord. Ienari accepted it, and Matsudaira Sadanobu was out. Ienari would eventually get his way. If you are wondering, Emperor Kokaku did not. His birth father was not honored with the title of retired emperor until after the Meiji Restoration, when the new imperial government made a point of doing it just to show those uppity Tokugawa shoguns what was what. All of this points to an important truth about Ienari. He was not, in fact, pliable despite his youth, and was not interested in taking directions from others when it didn't suit him. However, just because he had dismissed an advisor who had clashed with him did not mean Ienari was going to start taking an active hand in government. Indeed, while he was no longer the head of the Roju, Matsudaira Sadanobu hung on to influence for several more decades, thanks to friends of his who remained in the administration. Ienari, you see, didn't really care that much for the daily work of government, and so unless his ministers directly clashed with something he wanted, he was not going to get too up in their business, so to speak. So if he doesn't care about government, what did Ienari care about? Well, frankly, sex was pretty clearly at the top of the list. Before he'd even been heir to the shogunate, he had been betrothed to Shigehime, a daughter of the wealthy and powerful Shimazu family, the lords of Satsuma domain in southern Kyushu. However, Ienari did not have much time for her because he had a truly ludicrous number of consorts in his oku, the inner palace, the shogun's harem, in other words. Seriously, I cannot even find consistent numbers here. For the number of mistresses, I have seen numbers as low as 25 and as high as 40, probably because within the harem, some job titles that didn't seem on the surface to require servicing the shogun often did in fact include that demand informally, so to speak. Now, by itself, you might be surprised to hear this doesn't actually mean that much. The goal of the harem was not just, well, the obvious stuff, but a signal of power and prestige. After all, the people in its employ were by definition not exactly economically productive, so having a large harem was a way of signaling political power and wealth, not just a way to enjoy yourself, so to speak. But we have pretty good evidence that Ienari was not just in this to show off the number of people he could afford to employ. Evidence in the form of a great many kids. And I do mean a lot of kids. Again, the numbers I've seen are inconsistent. The low is 50 and the high is over 70. Frankly, I don't think the precise number matters that much. Everyone seems to agree the number is pretty high, and that's all you really need to know. Now, medicine being what it was at the time, infant mortality among these children was pretty high. I've seen different numbers again, but many of these children did not survive to adulthood. Still, a great many did, and we'll have more to say about them in a bit. But before we get there, there's one other thing Tokugawa Ienari has a historical reputation for caring about, being an absolute and wild party animal. Here, things are a bit more difficult to verify historically. The women of the Olku, the shogun's harem, were responsible for keeping a sort of diary of the shogun's activities, and those do make mention of regular drinking parties and the like, but that's also par for the course, the sort of celebrations anyone with political power would have. Frankly, it's very hard to separate rumor from reality here. The shogun's private life was by definition private, and it's not like anyone outside the shogun's inner circle or his harem really knew how he spent his day-to-day time. Indeed, that was kind of the whole point. A big part of life within the shogun's household was swearing to keep his secrets, because the protection of those secrets was a sign of true loyalty. Still, a lot of salacious rumors about Ienari did leak out, and his household was subjected to more than a few scandals. We actually talked about one of the biggest ones a while back, the so-called Kannoji scandal. This is the tale of Mio, the daughter of a Buddhist priest of the Nichiren sect named Nikkei. Nikkei was able to place his daughter in Ienari's household through a friendship with a former lady of the shogun's harem. Members of said harem were by custom made to become Buddhist nuns after the shogun's death, and presumably this was how she came to know Nikkei. Mio was in turn able to switch on the charm and win Ienari's heart, and within a few years had wiled her way into Ienari's inner circle. It's pretty clear she did use her charms to win Ienari's support for the Nichiren sect, which was rather unusual because Nichiren was considered a lowbrow sect of Buddhism, too unrefined for a high and mighty Tokugawa shogun. She also convinced Ienari to support construction of a new temple for her father, Kannoji, though today the temple is called Yakuoji. After Ienari died, an investigation by shogunal officials found that Mio and her allies in the harem had, in tandem with her father, led the ladies of the shogun's household into debauchery, sneaking them out for orgies and some such. But we can't totally take that on face value. Members of the shogunal bureaucracy were often jealous of the power women in the shogun's inner circle could wield, and would slander them with accusations of sexual impropriety to try and undercut their influence. Still, stories like this came to form the official image of Tokugawa Ienari, so to speak, that he was obsessed with women and would do whatever they said, and that he neglected government beyond what it could do for his ability to spend money on his favorites. In fact, this was the image that came to predominate even when Ienari was still alive. Probably the most famous example is one of the great works of late Edo literature, Nisei Murasaki Inaka Genji, or in English, A Fake Murasaki and a Rural Genji. As the name gives away, Inaka Genji, as it's known for short, was a spoof of one of the great classics of Japanese literature. Published as a kusazoshi, a wide-ranging genre but essentially combination of text and image that served as a predecessor of modern manga, the text is, of course, a send-up of the great classic Tale of Genji. The story is, frankly, a little convoluted. It's set during the 1400s in the lead-up to the massive civil wars of the Sengoku Jidai. The main character is one Ashikaga Mitsuuji, illegitimate son of the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the guy who triggered the start of the Civil War by being pretty checked out as a shogun. Mitsuuji is trying to get his hands on the family sword of the Ashikaga family, which has been stolen by one of their treacherous retainers, Yamana Solzen, an actual historical figure. As cover while he is plotting his devious revenge, Mitsuuji lives in Kyoto in the manner of a happy-go-lucky aristocrat, partying it up in a manner that is intended to evoke a heightened version of the tale of Genji. Mitsuuji gets into all sorts of hijinks along the way, partying up with the women of Kyoto and generally just living large. The text was massive. First published in 1829, it spans 52 volumes and was illustrated by the popular artist Utagawa Kunisada. The author was one Ryutei Tanehiko, pen name of Takaya Hikoshiro, son of a samurai family who were hatamoto or direct bannermen to the shogun. That connection led to more than a few suspicions that the story of Inaka Genji, with its elaborate parties and women of loose morality, was actually a spoof of Tokugawa Ienari's court. And taking a contemporary story and setting it in an earlier period of Japanese history was a classic way for authors during the Tokugawa years to get around censorship. After all, if a text is set in the 1400s, how could it possibly be criticizing events in the current day? Still, this clever excuse could only work for so long. After Tokugawa Ienari's death, conservative crackdowns led by officials looking to clean house led to eyes being turned on those seen as undermining the dignity of the shogunate. Suspicion regarding the true nature of Inaka Genji's story led to the text eventually being banned for slandering the shogunal house. Ryutei Tanehiko would end up under house arrest and would die shortly thereafter, though after the conservative crackdown ended, his publisher found new authors to continue writing volumes well into the 1850s because the stories sold really damn well. Inaka Genji was not the only contemporary text to satirize the shogun's court either. Keisei Suikoden, published around the same time, followed a similar pattern. This too was a kusazoshi riffing off an earlier work, in this case the Shuihujuan or Water Margin, one of the 4 great novels of Imperial China. If you're not familiar with it, the story revolves around a group of 108 righteous bandits who team up to face down corrupt and debauched officials in China's Song dynasty about 1,000 years ago. Keisei Suikoden takes that basic narrative and moves it over to Japan in the late 1100s, during the earliest years of samurai rule. Interestingly, it also gender flips much of the cast, so that it is a group of women bandits facing down the corrupt officials. And there's a lot to unpack there, but that's something to save for another episode, I think. The important thing is this text too was read as a criticism of Ienari's rule, which was seen as enabling corruption and debauchery among the Tokugawa leadership because of the extent to which Ienari himself was disengaged from politics. So even during his own lifetime, Ienari's reputation was not the greatest. And well, frankly, I don't think that reputation was made up out of whole cloth. There's enough circumstantial evidence like the whole Omio incident to be pretty compelling. I do think Ienari's reputation was somewhat the victim of the circumstances he lived in. What do I mean? Well, remember, this is not an age of transparent government by any standard. The goal of the Tokugawa shoguns was to keep the people in awe of them, not to keep them informed of the goings-on of state, which were, after all, not the concern of mere commoners. So information about what was happening in the shogun's palace was tightly controlled. Not much really slipped out about what actually was happening there, which in turn meant that when something did happen, say a crazy story about a seductive daughter of a common priest, people ate that up. How could they not? And these scant morsels of scandal came to be what people knew about Tokugawa Ienari. None of this is intended to suggest, though, that he was somehow secretly a good ruler, don't get me wrong. If nothing else, it's pretty clear the financial situation of the shogunate got substantially worse under him. The state's emergency reserve of gold and silver, valued at over 1 million ryo in 1798, had plummeted to 650,000 by 1830. And it's not like that money went into reform programs intended to, say, bolster coastal defenses as foreign incursions into Japanese waters got increasingly bold, or to shoring up the agricultural base of the economy. The money was spent to no real effect. However, I do not think it is fair to paint Ienari as a pure incompetent. There are moments where hints of political intelligence do shine through. For example, remember all those kids he had lying around? Well, Ienari was also famous for cleverly arranging political marriages for them. For example, if you've ever been to Tokyo University's Hongo campus, you've probably seen its famous Red Gate. That gate is from the old fortified compound of the Maeda family. They were required to build one when the Maeda clan daimyo married one of Ienari's many daughters, because that was an event that legally mandated a certain amount of pomp to celebrate. Through these marriage politics, Ienari was able to spread his influence to some of the most powerful families in Japan, securing marriage alliances for the shogunate in the offing. That's pretty clever, and everything I've read suggested that this was Ienari's idea. On the other hand, it's hard to escape the impression that Ienari was simply the wrong man for the job of shogun in the later Tokugawa years. It's easy to pin everything that went wrong on him, particularly through that lens of Confucian political morality that we discussed at the start of the episode. And with works like Inaka Genji and Keisei Suikoden defining his image, that is exactly what started to happen. By the early years of the Meiji era, the idea that Ienari's failures as shogun had led to the failure of the system itself was deeply embedded in discourse about the end of feudalism. You even see it replicated in some of the earliest English-language works on Japanese history, like George Sansom's A History of Japan. But I don't think it's entirely fair. Ienari was not a good shogun, but the problems of the shogunate were far deeper than any one guy with a taste for women in parties. It's easy to make one person's moral failings a stand-in for the failings of the system as a whole, but in the end, that's just an excuse. Things were far more complicated than that might suggest. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the start of a new mini-series on the history of communication technology in Japan, beginning with the telephone and telegraph.